Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see everybody here. It's my privilege to introduce our program chair and president-elect of the REA, Dr. Kathy Winings. My name is Hanan Alexander, if you don't know me, and I'll be filling in this gig next year as we prepare for the meetings next year in Toronto. Kathy is the Director of Ministry Program and Director of the Maryland campus and Professor of Religious Education and Ministry at the Unification Theological Seminary. She has also served as the Vice President for Academic Affairs at the seminary. Dr. Winings has also been instrumental in developing multiple new programs for the seminary, including a special joint endeavor with an integrative medical practice to offer new courses. She has served as campus minister in youth ministry and worked with ecumenical affairs before coming to UTS. Her research interests are in neuroeducation, social justice, and moral inquiry. She has developed diverse curriculum and ministry manuals for Sunday schools and youth ministries, and authored numerous articles, edited the book American Christian on American Christian denominations, and is author of the book Building Character Through Service Learning. I give you Dr. Kathy Winings.
I am a racist. Jarring statement, isn't it? I needed to start my journey this past year with this admission before I could even begin to consider how I relate to our theme and how the theme relates to me. For me, this has not been just another topic in a conference. It's been important because of the impact that white privilege has had on my students, my faculty, my institution, and myself. To go beyond white normativity is not a simple feat. I think we realize that. Racism and normativity have been an entrenched part of our culture, our society, and our lives. And for some of us, we've not been able to address it, let alone move forward and make the changes that are needed, because it is invisible. It is subtle. It is unconscious. Therefore, we need to begin to address white normativity by looking inward and being willing to live in the discomfort and the pain of such an acknowledgement. I am a racist. Quite shocking, isn't it? It shocks the system. I know it shocked me when someone first said it to me. Many of us, especially many white people like myself, don't like hearing that term, let alone when it's leveled at us personally. This is because, as Robin DiAngelo notes, we consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. So anytime someone tries to connect us to the system of racism and white privilege, it's perceived as an unfair or unsettling moral offense. Most of us work under the understanding, like myself, false though it may be, that if we're good, faithful, religious people, we can't be racist. We can't act that way. For this reason alone, we don't believe or see how we may be contributing to white normativity. We don't see how our language, our assumptions, our attitudes, or our actions might have been subtly shaped by normativity. And this is why I agree with our speaker this afternoon, Shelley Tuchluck, when she says that what we need to stop viewing a racist as someone who is evil, some kind of bad person, someone who is out there somewhere totally unconnected to us. We also need people who will support us in discovering those subtle and sometimes invisible ways in which racism and normativity continues to exist deep within ourselves. I had such a supportive person. He was the one who called me a racist, oddly enough. I had just opened up our first satellite campus in New York City, and working with several churches, our student body was completely different on this campus. It was primarily African American with some Latinx. This was a complete change from the main campus, where students were primarily Asian or white. In a meeting with the recruitment director, who was African American, he looked at me one day and said, "Hey, Doc, you're a racist." My immediate response was, "What? I am not. How dare you?" He said again, "You're a racist." And again, I responded very defensively that I couldn't be a racist. I'm a good Christian. Right? He continued by saying that he wasn't calling me a racist because I was a bad person or I'd done something or said something that was racist, but that as a white person, I simply don't always know when I do or say something that could be perceived as racist. I can unknowingly do something because it is so subtle and invisible. As he noted, he said, it's the same with me noting that I'm a sexist because I'm a man and I'm not aware of the impact of my words and actions on women. It is white normative culture that has shaped and formed me from birth as a white person. As Warren Bennis and Robert Thomas note, we have learned or been shaped in different crucibles or the transformative experiences that have shaped our identity throughout our lifetime. My recruiter further noted that until I acknowledged that I was a racist, I would not be able to help change the culture. Of course, I went home that day a little angry, a little confused, maybe a lot confused, and challenged. And it took time, reflection, and dialogue to begin to see the wisdom of his comments. D'Angelo defines my initial reaction to being called a racist as an example of white normativity. White fragility. White fragility is our effort to deflect these painful accusations. It's our way of protecting and defending ourselves from being viewed as a bad person. The racial stress that we feel after such accusations really trigger a range of defensive behaviors and emotions, including anger, fear, guilt, shame. Each of us engage in white fragility in different ways. Some may respond by saying, I don't see color, I'm colorblind. So I'm free of racism, so I can't be a racist. Others may respond by saying, but I value diversity. Some of my closest friends are African American or Hispanic. As a colleague said that to me in response to a blog article I wrote, first thing out of her mouth was, oh, many of my friends, I have a friend who's African American. So I can't be racist. A third typical response is, you're playing the race card, racial politics, because we now live in a post-racial world. Another way to look at this reaction is addressed by one of our papers this year by Daniel Helge, in which he posits that our reaction is partly attributable to our accumulation of emotional habits that in turn shape our white intuitions and our behavioral patterns. The same is found in neuroscience, in that we form neural pathways or neural clusters from the moment we're born around concepts. Throughout this year, I've witnessed numerous occasions of white fragility responses. In conversation with a white coworker on campus one day, I noted to him that his words to an African American colleague could be perceived as racist. He immediately got angry. He started screaming at me, actually. And he got up in front of my face and said, I'm not a racist, I'm a Christian. How dare you call me a racist? And another white coworker in the room overheard this, and he added, you know, when people of color raise the specter of racism, they're simply playing the race card because civil rights ended racism. As Touchlucker describes it, we choose to become colorblind and to adopt a transcendence-seeking optimism, both of which serve to hinder our ability to engage in these difficult conversations that are needed around race, privilege, and normativity. Francis Kendall describes our inability to tackle this difficult subject as anesthetizing ourselves so as to avoid feelings of guilt and other strong and confusing emotions that are present when addressing white privilege. There's another reason why it's important for me to begin this morning with such a direct and personal statement as I'm a racist. I have benefited from racism, though I didn't realize it, and I'm still not sure of all the ways that I have benefited because I am still learning. Educator Stephen Brookfield, with his new edited volume coming out this month, is correct when he offers that if we wish to encourage and lead others into reflecting on their own role in white normativity and how whites have benefited from white privilege, we need to earn the right to ask such sensitive questions by first exploring our own racial identity. We need to first model a public analysis of how racism is embedded in our worldview and how we maintain normativity. Issues involving race, gender, identity, normativity, and white privilege are extremely personal. They're so sensitive. So it's important for me to create a brave space within our conference this weekend through an analysis of my journey involving normativity, identity, and privilege, and through discussing our theme before I encourage anyone else here to take on an honest and open reflective process. Mary Hess also expressed this in her article, White Religious Educators and Unlearning Racism, Can We Find a Way?, when she noted that we begin unlearning racism by acknowledging our complicity in the system. As a result of this journey this year, I believe the critical issues central to addressing our theme in a meaningful way will include understanding the roots of white privilege and white normativity, looking to how I contribute to normativity, both consciously, but more importantly, unconsciously, and what needs to change in order to create truly brave spaces in our classrooms or our houses of worship that will allow us to move beyond it and dare to be transformative. Whiteness and white normativity didn't just appear or originate in a vacuum. They're rooted in both an ideological and a social system. This is because whiteness is about identity formation. The initial ideological system is racism. And racism, as we consider it today, is a belief system that holds that there are differences, inherent differences, among racial or ethnic groups, and that these differences are used to justify concepts of one race or ethnic group being superior or in a position to dominate the others because of those differences. We've seen examples of it in most parts of the world involving a wide range of peoples, and we continue to see it in our news today. Even this morning, a woman in North Carolina and her confrontation with two young black women, a white woman, in which she screamed at them, "I'm white, you're black, and you're wrong." We have seen examples of it in many areas of where separation and superiority is used to further shape how we see ourselves, our personhood, and our identity. Through our living out of that identity, this lived social experience then strengthens the identity we have formed and then continues to shape and reshape it continually. White normativity, then, is taking the dominant group's values and ways of living, their attitudes and perspectives, to define and to create social norms that are to be used to define the correct or normative way to live. As it continues to privilege the white culture's values, it serves to maintain white privilege. As D'Angelo describes it, white normativity rests on the definition of whites as the norm or the standard for human, and people of color as a deviation from that norm. So while white normativity makes use of and stems from racial differences, it goes much further. It also folds into its structure other attitudes and other viewpoints that have been embraced by the dominant culture, involving assumptions toward gender, age, physical ability, sexual orientation, because the standard used is that of a white, middle to upper class male Christian, as you'll see in some of the papers we'll be discussing this weekend. So let's look first at how these norms and perspectives were shaped. Race has been a convenient way, of course, to group or separate people along assumed lines of difference. Key component of our society has been our continued practice of othering social groups. We love to box people in, don't we? Love the labels by invoking physical difference as a way to place our own group in a better light or position. As Alexander Saxton noted in his study of race, racism is a theory of who is who, of who belongs and who does not, and of who deserves what and who is capable of what. Gloria Wecker, in speaking of the European context of racism, talks about it as racial grammar, or a deep structure of inequality in thought and effect based on race that has shaped the European sense of self. However, to state that race is a social construction doesn't mean it stands alone as a separate category or some master transcendent category that's apart from these points of difference. Race, class, gender, sexual orientation intersect. As noted by Michael Omi and Howard Winnett in their classic study on race formation in the United States, while each of these points of difference have helped to contribute to marginalization, normativity, and how we see difference in the world, race has had a very dominant role in defining privilege. While I'll be using the United States as a case study for this morning, the principles that we'll consider show the process of how one group anywhere in the world gains its privileged status and how its normative standard then is defined. The use of the word race and our understanding of racial categories reflect competing notions of identity, history, and destiny, and their impact on politics, economics, culture, power. As Matthew Jacobson points out, the history of race and whiteness in the U.S. can be seen as having gone through three distinct periods, with race playing out to different understandings, but with similar consequences: the maintenance and strengthening of white supremacy and normativity. Throughout its history, the forces that have continually shaped and reshaped race and whiteness are capitalism and republicanism, or economics, power, privilege. In the early colonial period, through to the tremendous growth of the early 1800s in America, while the term black was used to describe Africans and some West Indian peoples, it didn't trigger the use of the term white to describe the English or the Europeans. Nor was the concept of a white race or whiteness in the consciousness of the early settlers, at least initially. But that's not to say that the concept of privilege didn't exist. For many of the Europeans and European American immigrants, the distinguishing point for privilege was one's Christian identity, since to be Christian was to be part of God's chosen people So this sense of privilege and superiority didn't need to be based on skin color, since it was already present in one's religious identity. Race, though, began to assume a more central role because of political and economic reasons until the end of this initial period. Economically, this young enterprise here in America needed to develop a stable and fruitful economic base. Landowners needed cheap labor to manage the vast agricultural enterprise. And though both European Americans and African Americans served as bonded laborers, or euphemistically, or slaves, there was a subtle change toward the increased use of Africans as slaves. Why? Well, for one, bonded laborers could eventually be given their freedom, though European American laborers were given their freedom in far greater numbers than for Africans. This meant a decrease in available cheap labor. Landowners certainly couldn't afford to hire laborers from among the white populace to replace those who were freed. So they needed a different way of looking at servants and slaves to guarantee perpetual enslavement. Second, shifts subtly in the European viewpoint about the inappropriateness of owning Christian bonded laborers and the unsuitability of non-Christian African Americans owning Christian bonded laborers again began to limit labor to only non-Christians who were generally Africans and people of color. Again, the possible loss of huge numbers of indentured slaves threatened the viability of this network. So it was important economically to guarantee the enslavement of African Americans, and that any law addressing this issue become inclusive, also their spouses and their children. As D'Angelo suggests, exploitation came first, and then the ideology of unequal races followed as a way to justify the exploitation that ensued. Tied to this was also the political side of the equation, and the question of who was fit to govern this young country. Who could and should take responsibility for self-government? What would be the qualifications for a good citizen? So how people were categorized became important in defining citizenship. Well, slave laborers were deemed unfit. Why? Because they were viewed as less than human. They weren't one of the chosen people. So their religious identity and their color made them unsuitable to be citizens. Even when they began to convert to Christianity, the new laws were enacted to ensure their perpetual enslavement. This is why the law began to state citizenship was limited to all free white persons. At the same time, the growing system of landowners were fast becoming the new elite as citizens of this new nation. So they needed a new identity, or as Theodore Allen calls it, a new birthright. This new identity would be a constellation of observable characteristics and a unique perspective and attitude that would distinguish them. Hence, white normativity begins to develop. What I find very interesting this weekend is that the state that we're meeting in right now, Virginia, was the very first state in America to enact a series of white privilege laws. This is not lost on me in terms of our theme this weekend. Additional laws were passed to further privilege whites and to begin that separation. So whiteness and a sense of white privilege was now clearly established. The passage of the 1790 Naturalization Act ushered in a second period of growth, and this had some interesting intended and unintended consequences. By limiting citizenship to free white persons, of, now they added good character, the intended impact was a continued denial of citizenship to slaves, indentured servants, many women, if not most, and all people defined as non-white. This law hurt not only African Americans, but now expanded the non-white category through its inclusion of Asian Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Pacific Islanders. The others. The unintended impact of the law was the tremendous increase in European immigration from unanticipated regions of Europe, involving white laborers who were of lower income. And their fitness for self-government became highly questionable. So while these new immigrants were similar externally to the traditional white population, there were subtle differences among the Irish, the Italians, Slavic, and Germans in particular. This spurred some science to enter the picture to see if it was possible to clarify whiteness scientifically and biologically. It didn't happen, but our language also began to shift with the use of the labels Anglo-Saxon and Caucasian. Yet the same question remained. Did these new immigrants have what it took to participate meaningfully in government? Relying on the same derogatory terms for these newcomers that had always been applied to people of color raised the question of whether or not they could be compared to those considered as purely white or those who were granted citizenship. This period of mass immigration and migration ultimately culminated in the racially based and highly restrictive immigration legislation earlier in the 1900s. And that laid the foundation for a third period of growth. We see immigration quotas now being set on immigrants from specific countries, and also provided teeth in long-standing bans on other non-white immigrants. While the main targets of the law were Southern and East Europeans, it also included those from India, Arab, and Jewish immigrants. And it banned virtually all Asians. The law reflected this ongoing debate as to who was not just white, but more importantly, who would benefit from white privilege and who would not. These values, these attitudes, further shaped white normativity. You know, our exploration and expansion during this period added to the questions of race, personhood, and identity. And this, together with the need to continually differentiate who was white and therefore part of the ruling elite and who was non-white, demonstrate the role that power played in whiteness and white privilege issues. The growing acceptance of diverse peoples signaled the rise also of nativism and white supremacist groups, precursors of today's alt-right and diverse white supremacist associations. Power, control, privilege, characteristics that ground white normativity. At the heart of it all is not just the concept of race itself, but the perceptions tied to what it means to be white and non-white. The pejorative descriptors used to describe people of color have helped to maintain this designation of non-white and the justification to limit privileges. With the white population perceived as hardworking, intelligent, industrious, civilized, Christian, and non-whites perceived as having the opposite qualities, the base for white privilege and supremacy became firmly anchored. And we hear this in the current rhetoric around, for example, the Central American caravan making their way up through Mexico to the U.S., and about the wall for the border between the U.S. and Mexico. We hear it in the discussion of denying birthright to children born in the U.S. of immigrants. When discussing racism and whiteness, it is usually around the binary of black-white relations. And as we have experienced more recently, though, other racial and ethnic groups remind us that white supremacy is experienced beyond the black-white binary. We have Asian, Latinx, Native American, Arabs have become more vocal in lifting up their experiences with white privilege, which are often very different from that of black-white issues. As Courtney Goto expressed it, the black-white binary paradigm determines and limits discussions of race and racism by ignoring the experiences of people who are neither black nor white. And this has led to the question of language and how to label these diverse paradigms. Without addressing the issue of language, we can end up minimizing their very real experiences with white normativity, as noted in some of our papers this weekend. Again, though my frame of reference has been the U.S., the process of othering or dividing people between the dominant group and all others, resulting in these issues, we see this in European history, with the mass migrations recently, with people from Somalia, Syria, and elsewhere, seeking new homes throughout Europe. Another form of this process has been played out, of course, in Africa, with both apartheid, colonialism, and tribal divisions. Australia has experienced this in their history with the Aboriginal peoples, as has New Zealand and the Maoris, Canada with the First Nations, Hispaniola between Dominican Republic and Haiti also. The challenge of normativity is the same once the dominant culture has established the condition of privilege and created the standards that will be used to define the privileged status. So what does that mean for us going forward in understanding white normativity as religious educators and practitioners? I want to look at white privilege for a moment, white normativity. Of course, the ideological and social system that has shaped whiteness and white normativity has had centuries to define itself and to shape and expand it. In this time period, being perceived as white has become more than a mere racial classification. It has become a social and institutional identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others. As the Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal noted, this is the American dilemma. It is the conflict and contradiction between such biblical and democratic principles as justice, freedom, and equality, and the realities of discrimination, racial injustice, and inequality. The characteristics of those holding power became part of a set of standards and values by which a normative way of life has been defined and assessed. Even with this long history, whiteness and white normativity is what some have called the unexamined norm. Susan Davis noted, whiteness as the norm has been so completely built into our thinking patterns and religious imagery that we notice it as little as fish notice water. Interesting image, don't you think? Joseph Barnt, like Francis Kendall, has also called it an anesthesia that alters our state of mind. There are many challenges that we face as white people in moving beyond white normativity. The biggest challenge, I think, is the invisibility of whiteness and white supremacy. It is such an internalized system. Its invisibility is its greatest defense. Ruth Frankenberg writes that whiteness and normativity are only visible to those who are affected by it, those who are not white. Another challenge I think we have is our assumption that, for the most part, we as white people have not been raised to see ourselves in racial terms. As a dominant group, we have that privilege, so to speak. We can choose to ignore race and we do. Growing up, I wasn't aware that I had a racial identity. It was only when I began working on this conference that it hit me what I used to think as a child and as a young adult. My classmates who were African American or Latinx or Asian had a racial identity in my view. Why? Because most people in my school, my church, my community looked like me. I didn't see any of us as having a race. We were the dominant group. Race only applied to non-white people. And I know many others have had this perspective. Another assumption we hold is that while we as whites may see ourselves as racially innocent, we assume that people of color are not because they're raced. We expect people of color to teach us, whites, about race and racism. That it is up to people of color to raise the questions, to begin the hard conversations, and to do the work of breaking down whiteness and white normativity. As one of my colleagues in REA frames it, to do the heavy lifting. Throughout this year, she's reminded me, please, we're not the ones to do the heavy lifting. It is not our task. And again, this assumption stems from white privilege. We assume as whites, there's no problem. Doesn't impact me. I don't have a problem with it. How many of us have at one time or another waited for and probably wanted a person of color to initiate this potentially painful conversation? I did. I waited. I didn't think anything about the possibility that my course resources, for example, may be contributing to white normativity or may be limited in this way. I didn't think about it at all. They were great resources. They were great scholars. I didn't see them as being white or not white. That is, unless a student raised the issue. No student said anything usually about my resources, so I assumed nothing was wrong, that they were satisfied. And the same can be true for the other aspects of white normativity, such as gender-biased issues and sexual identity discrimination. You know, I had an experience in one of my Doctor of Ministry courses that I taught with 2 books that I used, both written by white authors. And I thought they were great texts. I said, well, one was from a white evangelical that offered some great ideas on ministry. And the other one was by a classic scholar talking again about issues in religion and context. My students, I was really shocked. They violently reacted. Hey, don't ever use those books again. I couldn't understand why. And they didn't tell me why. Only in this past year have I understood why. I don't use them anymore in that class because my students are primarily African American. It was only the African Americans that complained and a couple of women. And now I know why. They didn't give voice to my students. The students couldn't, they were completely oblivious to our students' reality. And my students couldn't learn. I got it. I got it. Another challenge I think we as whites face in trying to address normativity is we see ourselves as individuals. We don't see ourselves as a member of a group. We've been taught to value our unique individualism. So we don't see ourselves as representing white people. I don't see myself as representing whites, or I didn't before now. So, and we feel angry if someone judges us as part of a group. We become upset sometimes and say, don't put me in that category. I'm an individual. I'm not like the others. That's not true, though, is it, for people of color and those who don't fit the norm? Generally speaking, they're usually viewed by whites as being a representative of a specific race, group, or gender, such as, these are things I've heard this year. She did well for an African American woman. Hey, the Gonzalez family's really kept up their home, considering they're from Mexico. Or Linda handled that like a man. That's great, even though she's a woman. Or not bad for a gay person. I know I've had moments like this over the past year. To be perfectly honest, since I've been living here in Maryland, in Prince George County, I was driving home a particular route, and I noticed, and in my mind, I said every time I drove down Temple Hills Road, I said, wow, the African American community here is really environmentally conscious. And one day it hit me. Why? Why did I need to qualify that by saying African American? Why not just say Marylanders or the residents in this area are more conscious of the environment? Believe me, I was shocked. I sat in my office with my head in my hands, and I'm going, God, Kathy, don't you know better? You prided yourself in knowing more. And still, on a subtle point like this, you dared to think that. Like I said, it's been an interesting year. There's a secondary challenge to this issue of individualism that offers a particular challenge here in the United States. It's all too easy at times for whites to question the existence of whiteness because we've been taught that anybody can succeed, that we all have the equal ability and equal opportunity to make it in this world. It is this can-do kind of rugged individualism of Teddy Roosevelt and the American dream. Of course, the American dream, white picket fence, mom and dad, nice yard in the suburbs, and the family's white. There are no barriers to individual success if we're willing to work for it. And if we fail, it's only because we didn't want it badly enough or we didn't do what was needed. And we're numbed into thinking that because we now see far more people of color, Asian Americans, Native Americans, African Americans, women, gays, worshiping together in movies, television, and ads, and print media, and the same individuals winning these prestigious awards, that racism and discrimination no longer exist. So understanding whiteness and white normativity is perceived often as an intellectual experience for white people because we're not forced to deal with it. There are few negative consequences if I choose not to address this, to be honest. Unless some incident occurs in a very public manner, or it highlights the implications of white privilege, or there's a legal issue at stake, I probably will suffer no consequences if I ignore it. Doesn't mean someone doesn't suffer consequences. As the late James Cone lamented, despite the sit-ins and pray-ins, the civil rights movement and black power, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, white theologians still continue their business as usual. Another challenge in addressing whiteness and white normativity is how we define the issue and how we decide to approach it. White normativity at its heart is a question of me being at the center. Life is being defined around me. Why? Because I'm white. As a white person, I represent the dominant group and the dominant view. So if I do recognize the problem, how I choose to do something about it becomes often the problem. This perspective may take the form of, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so guilty of this. I feel so sorry for what happened. And we become so emotional about it. We start crying, and then with our tears and our emotions, whiteness then becomes about our white distress and our white suffering. Consequently, instead of our focus shifting to the issue of people of color and white normativity, the center of tension remains where? Here, with me. And I've been guilty of that. I have been guilty of that. We start making decisions that affect people of color often without taking them into account. And then we invite them in and expect them to jump on board and to show appreciation because we understand. Where's the partnership? Where's the reality of the relationship? Whiteness privileges those of us who are white in so many ways. I'm free to not hear about the pain of discrimination and privilege. I'm free to not see race in myself, yet I can get angry if someone else says something about it. We're free to declare white privilege is not our issue. We have the ability to discount people of color, or discount women, or discount those with different sexual orientations, or discount their words by our own words, assumptions, and actions. This is because the dynamics between the dominant and non-dominant group are not evenly weighted. Those who are privileged have more weight. As women experience all too often, a sexist or gender-biased situation is often dismissed when a man says, "She's feeling a little emotional right now." Those few words shift the issue from one of gender bias to the woman's seeming inability to handle the situation. Same would be true if the issues involved sexual identity or ethnicity. So this gives us a sense of what white normativity may look like in general, but what does it look like within our context as religious educators? White normativity has different dimensions within our context, religiously and educationally. Normativity can be present in how our course is structured, the resources, the pedagogies we may use. This translates into whether or not our students experience their voice and can relate to the goals and resources utilized in the course. There's a great video series called Color of Fear. A little pricey to rent, but it's impactful. It's a group of diverse individuals sitting together in a circle talking about these issues. It is nothing is spared. There's no holds on it. They pull their punches equally. There's also an interesting video show series on Netflix called Dear White People, which is also quite interesting. It's written by a perspective from the viewpoint of a group of African American students in a very Ivy League type private exclusive university, and their experiences in their classes, with their faculty, with their white student classmates. Normativity in the university. Normativity is also present in our attitudes and our expectations. You know, I expected my African American students to respond as I did as a white graduate student in a predominantly white school reading white resources. I expected they would respond the way I did. They didn't. And I never got why until now. I'm beginning to get it. Again, I've only been on this journey for about a year. So it takes time to peel away these layers of assumptions that I have. And every time I think I turn a corner and understand it and I got it, something else comes up, right? It's another layer of this issue. Normativity is present in how we challenge our students, what directions we challenge them in. It's seen in what we choose to present as the real world and what our response should be as religious, faithful people. Normativity can be visible in our unconscious assumptions and perspectives in our curricula or our programs that we develop. It can be seen in the choice of music, liturgy, and images that are used in our houses of worship or classrooms, in our hymns, as you'll see by Janiqua Green highlights in her paper on hymnody. Lord, make me white as snow. Normativity can be maintained in our fear of being uncomfortable and unable to endure the pain that comes with acknowledging our role in maintaining it. Our fear is more often found in our avoidance strategies, These strategies can include keeping quiet, staying in the background, sitting in the back row. No implications here, please. No implications here. But sure, we don't want to engage it. We don't want to feel the pain. These strategies can include also disengaging. Kim Case and Annette Hemmings talk about distancing strategies. We see distancing or avoidance efforts in actions such as being silent to avoid the difficult conversations about privilege. We also distance ourselves through what's called social dissociation. Now, through this strategy, we work at convincing others that we're not a racist or sexist, and we're not buying into white privilege. The third distancing strategy is called separation from responsibility, where we blame others for not confronting it, while distancing ourselves so that we're not implicated in all of this. So in assessing our own context in our classrooms, our houses of worship, our educational materials, what did we grow up seeing? Think for a moment what your experience was. You know, I grew up in a very simple, typical suburban United Methodist Church in Indiana. As a teen, I remember the little blue booklet that was used for our confirmation class. I don't know if any of you Methodists remember the little blue booklet, about maybe yay thick. And it had great images of bright and happy white youth. My Sunday school class and youth ministry, of course, were filled with white youth because the African American community lived across the tracks, the other side of the tracks. And I never knew what that meant either until I got older. Even Jesus was portrayed as a blue-eyed Caucasian who spoke English. At least that was my memory growing up. I can only say what I experienced, right? And remained so for several more decades. So in reviewing some recent educational programs, I looked at some publishing houses like Standard Publishing. I noticed an ad for one of the series had a male announcer, and of the 9 speakers, 8 were white men, and the 9th, white woman. Speaker for most of the publications from Lifeway were white, and most were men. And I noticed that if they talked about Scripture, only the men talked about it. The women talked about family. Not one woman read a biblical quote. I found that very interesting. This is just one dimension where we might find expressions of normativity. There are many others. Now, as I said, until last year, I didn't see how white normativity was a part of what I did in my classroom. I had always thought I was an engaging teacher. We all do, I think. We like to think that. You know, I was able to create an environment in which my students learned. Students were active. They were usually well prepared, generally looked forward to class, I think. They were challenged to think critically and to not just learn something cognitively, but to learn how to apply it in their life. All of my students in this past year have been African American. My campus here in Maryland is all African American. I am the only non-African American. I'm the only white. I thought that their voices were represented. Yet all the resources I've used were by white voices, representing white perspectives, white assumptions, and all taught by a white woman. I always received strong course evaluations, but now I wonder, were they afraid of voicing things? Did I not give them space to voice things? Were they afraid of losing their generous scholarships? We were offering 100% scholarship at one time. You never heard a complaint from the students. Now I understand. Last spring and fall, though, I began to reflect on this, of course, and I changed. I began to integrate new resources through the help of my colleagues here in REA with some great resources that are out of the box, that deal with questions of privilege, that offer a different perspective than I can ever offer. Their voices are being heard, I hope. Preparing my courses and even preparing this address, I have to admit, has been unusually difficult. In the past, when I organized my courses, it's been a question of designing my outcomes, my rubrics, looking at the myriad of sources to use, what pedagogies am I going to use, all the while thinking of my students, though not seeing my students as African Americans, just seeing them as students. I was colorblind. And why am I still questioning things? Because I'm not sure yet of all the ways that white normativity has shaped my crucible of experiences. Nor do I know all the ways that my institution has been shaped by normativity. I have to say also that I don't know all the ways that white privilege has impacted me or my students. So this leaves us with brave spaces, the other part of our theme. If we're to move beyond white normativity, we need to develop a sense of our identity. And though whiteness has been shaped through centuries of transformative experiences, crucibles that have formed our identity under whiteness or white normativity, that means we need new crucibles. We need new transformative experiences that will work to reshape our identity. Previously, in education, we used to use the term safe space. People asked me why I didn't use that phrase for the title. Well, safe space has been used to denote the goal of our work to create a classroom, an environment where students could feel safe to be themselves, comfortable, that regardless of what was happening in the wider world, a safe classroom would reflect this calm, hospitable space where they could study freely and learn. It was a space in which we could be challenged to think deeply, yet be encouraged positively. But is that enough today? I don't think it is, personally. A safe space does not necessarily mean that one feels empowered to contribute, to speak out, to begin to work toward the change that is needed. A safe space is not always a place in which one feels encouraged to take the risks and to engage meaningfully toward change with courage. This is why as scholars, researchers, and practitioners, we need to look toward creating brave spaces in our houses of worship and our educational institutions. A brave space takes those with whom we work beyond the feeling of safety. A brave space is when one feels that they have the opportunity and the freedom to speak about these difficult issues, these painful issues and topics. It's a space in which they feel they can be risk takers as they find their voice and they use it appropriately. However, whereas a safe space allowed us to feel safe emotionally and physically, a brave space isn't necessarily about feeling comfortable or free of pain. In fact, it's the opposite. A brave space is about being empowered but being vulnerable, being exposed, being willing to listen to the difficult stories and the difficult reflections, to use Robert Bostrom's language, and so able to work with the pain that may result. Now, in terms of our meeting theme this weekend, a brave space is about challenging, of course, our students and congregants to use their voices, to challenge expressions of normativity, regardless of the form it's taking, knowing it's painful, and to be willing to risk safety. Tim Wise notes, white people often seek a place of safety when confronted with dialogue involving difference or injustice. As noted earlier, there's often resistance to wanting to engage in an assessment of normativity. But a brave space won't allow us to avoid that discussion. Safe spaces may, and therein is a difference. Only in a brave space are we challenged to speak, to listen, to hear. So that's why we need to up the ante this weekend and look at how to create brave spaces in our context. As one of our paper writer notes, religious education has the ability to raise the kind of deep questions about human values and identity that are necessary to forming new crucibles. Thank you, Thomas Murphy. What does this involve? Rather than offer answers at this point in our meeting, it's too early for me to give you answers, and I don't have the answers. I would rather offer some guiding questions to help us this weekend. Our discussions around breakout sessions, the papers, the poster sessions, which will be awesome, will offer specific ideas and thoughts. So I just want to set up a few categories for all of us to consider this weekend to support our reflection process and how to create the necessary brave space. Let me suggest first that the context itself is a very important aspect of creating a brave space. Context challenges us to ask the key question, how does our space play into white normativity? Papers this weekend look at some very specific context, such as Catholic schools, Georgia public schools, Eastern Europe, black-white schools in the Netherlands, a uniting church in Australia, and the freedom schools, for example. How does the space maintain the air of authority and control? In what ways is it encouraging students to be risk takers? And in what ways does it encourage distancing and avoidance? You know, in preparing for our meeting in this plenary session, I thought long and hard about the design of this room and how it contributes to the theme. What is being communicated if I sit at the podium as usual with all of you in theater style looking forward where the locus of control is up there? What does it communicate? Yeah. Versus when I sit here in the center and everyone's looking at each other in a circle. Context. How does decentering this context support a brave space? How might our classrooms, our Sunday schools, and other educational settings support the creation of brave spaces? Second, methodologies, pedagogies are some of the strongest tools that we have in creating brave spaces. Many of our presenters this weekend will discuss types of critical pedagogy and methodologies that will support the creation of brave spaces. Methodologies in the papers talk about unlearning racism and white privilege, critical listening skills, digital storytelling, critical thinking, journaling, creating a pedagogy of whiteness. Narratives and storytelling uses sources from voices deemed as other. Recognizing feminist and womanist pedagogies as effective for brave spaces. Utilizing Evelyn Parker's biblical pedagogical strategies that challenge us to question and look with fresh eyes into what Scripture might teach us in terms of examining white privilege. So how do our pedagogies communicate white normativity? What pedagogies are possible that will help us get to the heart of the problem of privilege? What pedagogies will draw our students out to be risk takers rather than avoiding these issues, who are willing to endure painful discussions? What pedagogies are possible? And third, about our resources, our content. Certainly, content is so central to the difficult issues that we need to address in going beyond white normativity. Much of theological education historically, and many of us in the room know this, has relied on established theological, historical, scriptural, and philosophical sources to ground us theologically, and we use them to ground our students, right? Theologically. Though some may have subtly expressed white normativity, but we didn't recognize it. But at the same time, we're coming to realize that our students are walking theological statements themselves. They offer a wealth of content. Such sources allow us to look at our traditional sources with new eyes, with a new perspective that's not grounded in whiteness, such as using womanist biblical scholarship. This weekend, there are other disciplines that we can draw on for our content, as you'll notice, say, in the study of Hannah Arendt's concept of natality, looking at Horst Bushnell in a very different way, or the use of science fiction to open students up to this challenging topic, or even considering U.S.-North Korean political issues and its implications for religious education. So what resources might reflect the voices of our students? What type of content are we avoiding? Where might we find effective resources and content that will take us beyond white normativity? At the end of the day, we have the opportunity to do something truly meaningful, not only this weekend, but when we return home. At a time in which we are experiencing division, violence, hatred, with one group or another trying to assert their dominance, we have the opportunity to genuinely take steps to move beyond white normativity through the creation of brave spaces. As Dr. Martin Luther King noted, racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. Religious education, though, reverences the opposite of such a philosophy. Our work as religious educators emphasizes teaching about human value, our identity, and the meaning of our life. It's about creating the opportunity and the space for individuals to come to realize their essential identity. Hopefully an identity that is shaped and reshaped away from white normativity and formed instead by the best theological concepts of the faiths that each one of us here in this room represent. In actuality, this is the beginning of what King called beloved community. So the best way to end this morning is to note that this is actually just the beginning. As you go to your breakout sessions this weekend, I hope you will find and keep some of these questions in mind. Take good notes, share experiences, share your voice that will either give you and find insight in how you might be challenged by white normativity or how you're experiencing white normativity, or that will give you inspiration on how to create brave spaces in your own classrooms and communities of faith. You know, there's a great story about a wise old man that lived in this village up in the mountains. And he stayed in his cave all year, but came down to the village once a year. And he'd speak with the villagers. But two little 9-year-old boys decided one year, they cooked up a scheme. They wanted to prove how stupid this old man was, right? Youthful exuberance. Those of you who have sons or daughters understand this. They decided, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to hold a bird in my hand. And we're going to ask the old man, is the bird dead or alive? And if the old man says the bird is dead, I'm opening my hands and the bird will fly away. But if the old man says the bird is dead, I'm going to squeeze the life out of that little bird and show them he's gone. Right? So So the old man comes down. Kids come up to him. Old man, we have a question, burning question for you. Right? You imagine these 2 9-year-old kids. We've got this burning question. We have a bird in our hand. Is this bird dead or alive? The old man strokes his beard. He goes, I really don't know. The 2 boys elbow each other and go, now we got him. We got him. He says, but, of course, as educators and pastors, we know about that terrible word, but I do know, dead or alive, the future is in your hands. So as religious educators, practitioners, the hopeful future is in our hands. God bless you and have a wonderful conference this weekend.